For decades, the prevailing consensus held that the future lay in ever greater diversity, open borders, and a conception of nationhood based purely on citizenship rather than ancestry or culture. A nation defined by shared citizenship rather than ancestry was presented as a more advanced, more enlightened alternative, a sign of political progress. Yet ethnic and cultural questions are returning to the center of politics. Political parties built around issues of identity, culture, demographics, and immigration are gaining support across much of the Western world. What deeper forces are driving this shift, and what does it reveal about the true foundations of national unity? The debate about what is a nation, as posed by Ernest Renan in his 1882 essay, has continued for more than a century. Some have argued that a nation is a community united by a shared allegiance and loyalty to a state, while others have argued for different definitions of nationhood, such as one based on shared ethno-cultural bonds. The former, Civic Nationalists, argue that the main marker of belonging to a nation is legal citizenship, and that every citizen of a country is part of the same nation. Ethnic nationalists, on the other hand, define nationhood through shared ethno-cultural characteristics. That means that everyone belonging to a shared ethnicity is part of the nation. The two concepts have become the main dividing line in the debate over the source of national boundaries and national identity. There are obvious differences between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Civic nationalism is clearly more focused on inclusion, while ethnic and even cultural nationalism is more exclusive, since the definition of nationhood is based more on shared ethnic roots and cultural bonds rather than citizenship, which can be acquired through legal recognition regardless of a person's ancestry. Due to its inclusive nature, civic nationalism has been the most widespread form of nationalism in the post-World War II Western world. The experiences of World War II pushed the Western world toward a more inclusive concept of community. It was argued that ethnic or racial thinking in Germany was at the root of the problems the world had to grapple with in the 1930s and 1940s. At the same time, the popularity of civic nationalism within official discourse increased in parallel with rising immigration in the Western world beginning in the 1950s. It is worth remembering, however, that ethnic and racial preoccupations were not common only in Germany before World War II. American scholar Madison Grant, in his 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, elaborated on concerns about immigration by people of non-Nordic stock into countries where the majority was of Nordic heritage. American historian Tenny Frank conducted research into ancient Rome and how immigration by foreign ethnic groups contributed to its collapse. However, after World War II, any kind of ethnic thinking was largely swept aside, becoming taboo even to discuss. It was argued that only cosmopolitan visions could heal the world from its past traumas, and civic nationalism naturally fit into that narrative. While civic nationalism still preserves some characteristics of nationalism, it makes the boundaries of the community inclusive enough for people of all backgrounds to potentially join it. It was a natural ally of the post-war liberal elites who sought to synthesize the concept of the nation-state, in which the world still operated, with increasing economic and political globalization, evidenced by the growing international involvement, international treaties, global trade, open borders, and the free flow of capital. Scholars such as Karl Popper, who helped shape the core of post-war Western ideology, argue that nationalism is one of the most prominent enemies of the open society because it appeals to tribal instincts, passions, and prejudices, which were seen as incompatible with the modern Western agenda. Similarly, John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas presented love for one's nation as an expression of primal feelings, contrasted with a preference for freedom, autonomy, justice, and reason, which they viewed as product of individual development and maturity. Many scholars saw civic nationalism as superior to ethnic nationalism, because it defined loyalty through shared political principles and values rather than attachments to inherited rather than chosen characteristics, which were believed to have been overcome in Western societies. Civic nationalism became such a powerful force within Western intellectual and political elites that in their minds it even became a marker separating the developed Western countries from the undeveloped, and thus tribal and ethno-nationalist Eastern countries. This mode of thinking was especially widespread after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the emergence of many independent states and nations whose societies still adhered to ethnic nationalist principles. It was argued that these countries were not developed enough to become part of the Western Club, and that they needed to reform in order to genuinely become part of the modern world. Their nationalisms were seen as representing a different stage of political development from those of Western countries. Many Western scholars and politicians viewed civic nationalism as a hallmark of Western thought. They considered it a product of the West's moral and economic development, which distinguished it from the rest of the world. In contrast, the ethnic nationalism of Eastern European countries, based on folk culture, ethnic roots, and language, was often seen as primitive and crude. However, almost 40 years have passed since the collapse of the Iron Curtain, and ethnic nationalist thinking has spread not only in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe as well. Concerns about immigration, security, and demographics have pushed Western electorates to vote for parties that would have been considered too extreme 30 years ago. The debate over immigration has led to a stark shift in attitudes within Western societies regarding who can and can't be part of the nation. Many people have questioned the previously widespread assumption that all humanity is made up of fundamentally similar, interchangeable individuals, and that ever greater inclusion is always desirable. Civic nationalism, which purposefully blurred the boundaries of the community, naturally began to fall out of favor. Eastern European countries have also hardened their nationalist positions, rejecting immigration policies promoted by the European Union and many Western countries during the 2010s. It is now outdated to claim that developed Western countries follow a civic form of nationalism because of their supposedly more advanced moral and political development, and that civic commitments always trump ethnic loyalties in developed Western societies compared to Eastern Europe. However, what exactly proved this line of thought to be erroneous? Civic nationalist thinkers sought to liken the nation to a contract that otherwise separate individuals sign in order to join the nation. They expressed a contractual understanding of community and nation. However, new reality suggested that a nation must be something more fundamental, that it needs stronger foundations to preserve unity in a way that is also intergenerational. A nation is something that defines the identity, not merely a transaction. It may be better understood as an extension of family rather than a contractual arrangement. Civic unity proved to be too abstract concept to be fully realized in practice. Although civic nationalists expected that a purely contractual community could maintain the same levels of solidarity and social cohesion, it has become evident that as diversity grows, mutual understanding and solidarity declines, and individuals become less committed to upholding their part of the contract. After all, if there is nothing to bind society together, if even integration into a community upon immigration is not required, and if immigration threatens the demographic core and founding stock of a country, if the only thing that unites the people of a country is a legal formality, is such a country truly a unified nation with a shared national commitment? The civic form of nationalism was able to enjoy dominance in the Western ideological mainstream during the decades following the end of World War II. As long as immigration remained relatively low and there were fewer perceived threats to national homogeneity, civic nationalism appeared to work. Political elites could afford to ignore the resulting problems associated with mass immigration until they no longer could. At the time, Western countries enjoyed relatively homogeneous ethno-cultural compositions and could not fully comprehend the challenges that mass immigration might pose. However, as increasing diversity undermined national homogeneity, civic nationalist mantras suddenly no longer held the same power they had only a short time earlier. Western societies were willing to ignore the issue of ethnicity as long as states remained largely homogeneous and national consolidation had already been achieved. But the erosion of national homogeneity revealed the enduring power of ethnicity, as it once again emerged as a significant factor amid changing social conditions. As growing diversity appeared to upset the previous balance and ethno-cultural homogeneity, concerns became increasingly apparent, including the erosion of the familiar public sphere. The emergence of ghettos and various closed communities in Western countries led many to question whether everyone can integrate equally, and whether there really are no qualitative differences among people from different backgrounds. The core concept of community underpinning the political order became unsettled because mass immigration increasingly challenged the ethno-cultural unity and shared identity of these countries. This led to a growing loss of the unifying consciousness, Based on a common understanding of history, language, norms, and culture, the proponents of open society argued that growing diversity would lead to greater tolerance and even more diversity. However, paradoxically, growing diversification has made ethnic nationalism more popular and relevant. They fail to take into consideration that increasing diversity could undermine the homogeneous structure of society upon which national unity depends, and that this would create a pressure to limit further diversification, now seen by many as a destabilizing factor. Naturally, many began searching for firmer foundations on which to define the national community, whether through common ancestry or culture. Although left-wing scholars have argued that ethnic nationalism is a modern construction, it is worth remembering that even in the 5th century BCE, ancient Greeks defined the Greek identity through shared blood, language, religion, and customs, factors that also informed the functioning of their democratic polities. The modern search for a renewed sense of nationhood can be seen as a rediscovery of a tradition of thinking that had been largely absent from the West for several decades. Indeed, immigration issues have highlighted the perceived necessity of clearly defining what constitutes a national community and who belongs to it, because a national community can be understood as an extended concept of family that commands mutual solidarity from its members. If differences between people become too great for them to bond together, can solidarity be reasonably expected? Naturally, such societies may become more prone to instability and conflict. Politics may cease to be primarily a competition of ideas, and instead come to reflect ethnic fragmentation, with different groups competing against one another and voting primarily on the basis of ethnic interests. This leads to the multi-ethnic societies often requiring authoritarian structures to continue stable functioning, a pattern that appears to conflict with modern preferences for democratic governance. However, the concept of democracy itself has not escaped redefinition along more inclusive lines. The traditional understanding of democracy held that it depended upon the existence of a cohesive demos, sharing enough common characteristics to exercise self-government. Today, however, democracy is often employed as a justification for policies that erode the cohesion of national communities. Parties and politicians seeking to limit immigration are frequently portrayed by the establishment as threats to the democracy. However, the issues cannot simply be sidelined because they are uncomfortable. The challenges of the present era have prompted many to reconsider assumptions long taken for granted and to look beyond mainstream viewpoints. Thus, many perceived problems with civic nationalism have become clearer. It does not provide a coherent definition of nationhood because it is too vague. It purposefully blurs national boundaries, and it essentially allows anyone to become a potential member of the nation regardless of background. It overlooks the fact that nationalism relies on cultural, linguistic, symbolic, and other features that mark the boundaries between those who belong to the nation and those who do not. If a society shares no common characteristics, it may quickly lose its unity, turning that lack of cohesion into one of its greatest weaknesses and a source of instability. This suggests that abstract principles alone cannot define a nation, and that more tangible features are required. Civic nationalism is therefore too abstract and legalistic to bind society together, inevitably leading to the rise of ethno-cultural nationalism. As a result, growing concerns associated with mass immigration and related developments, along with the erosion of national identity, have pushed many people to reassert traditional conceptions of the nation-states, which have historically acknowledged the importance of some degree of homogeneity for their continued existence.